In about 2 weeks, the American people will go to the polls to determine the direction of our nation. There are many important issues voters will consider as they decide which way they'll cast their vote. Their decisions will ultimately determine who's president and the makeup of Congress. One issue that's always front and center in any election is the economy and the economic policies of the respective candidates. This election is no different. There are many differences in the economic policies that would be pursued by a Republican-led administration versus the path my Democrat colleagues would take if they are in charge. One particular stark difference is tax policy that both sides can be expected to pursue. Over the past 4 years, President Trump and Republicans in Congress have enacted historic tax cuts, particularly for middle-class Americans. And that's been part of a long overdue revamp of our tax code. This included reducing tax rates across the board, significantly increasing the standard deduction, and doubling the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000. As a result of these changes, a typical family of four earning $70,000 saw their tax bill reduced by $2,000. While my Democrat colleagues have done their best to distort this reality about middle-income tax cuts, IRS tax return data in 2018 confirms that middle-income Americans saw significant tax reductions. In fact, taxpayers in the middle of the income distribution saw their tax bill reduced by an average of more than 13%. My Democratic colleagues and former Vice President Biden have made no bones about their plans for tax reform. And their tax reform would be tax increases. If they prevail in the upcoming elections, they'll seek to reduce and undo the 2017 tax law and impose trillions of dollars in tax hikes on individuals and businesses. The former vice president has sought to deflect accusations that he would raise taxes on low and middle income taxpayers by promising only plans to increase taxes on businesses and individuals with annual incomes over $400,000. There are many reasons to be skeptical of this vice president's promise, so I want to discuss this skepticism. First, a similar assurance was made by the Obama-Biden administration in their first term. Many will recall the Obama-Biden administration promised not to raise taxes on married couples earning less than $250,000 or $200,000 for single filers. That promise was tossed out the window when a host of new taxes that fell directly or indirectly on middle-income Americans were enacted to pay for Obamacare. That included individual mandate penalty tax, 80% of which was paid by taxpayers earning less than $50,000 a year. This is exactly why Republicans repealed that individual mandate as part of the 2017 tax law, because it was very regressive. A second reason, low and middle income Americans should take little comfort in former vice president's promises only to tax the rich and businesses is that such tax too often get passed along. There is well-documented principle in any tax policy that simply because laws impose a tax directly on an individual or business doesn't mean the ultimate burden of that tax won't fall on others indirectly. Every analysis of Mr. Biden's tax plan by independent third parties, from the very liberal Tax Policy Center to Penn Wharton to the American Enterprise Institute, so liberal, moderate, and conservative, shows taxpayers earning less than $400,000 will shoulder at least a portion of Mr. Biden's proposed tax increase. So this comes from the fact that the tax increases largely reflect the economic consensus that a significant portion of the corporate income tax falls on workers in the form of reduced wages and benefits. In other words, workers pay even if you increase the corporate tax rate. Our nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation has estimated that hurting the workers with a 25% increase in the corporate tax increase is, in fact, borne by workers. Mr. Biden, of course, has promised to increase the corporate income tax from 21% to 28%. Now, according to Penn Wharton budget model, this business tax will mean that over 90% of the households with income between $45,600 and $121,000 will see an increase in their total tax burden. With the bulk of Mr. Biden's tax agenda targeted at hiking taxes on capital, the consequences then will be felt throughout the economy in the form of lower wages, fewer jobs, and slower economic growth. According to a study out of the Hoover Institution this week, the Biden plan holds the promise of reducing per capita gross domestic product by more than 8% when compared to the current law, with the 2017 Trump tax law being made permanent. And that raises an additional important issue. Taxpayers should take Mr. Biden's promise not to raise their taxes with a whole grain of salt, because the vast majority of Americans will see a tax increase beginning in 2026 unless the 2017 tax cuts are made permanent. A top priority for President Trump and the congressional Republicans has been to make permanent the middle-class tax cuts that were enacted in 2017, which otherwise would sunset 2025. President Trump has called for making the tax cuts permanent as part of each of his budget submissions in Congress. Now we have Democrats refusing to work with Republicans to make the tax cuts, the middle-income tax cuts of 2017, permanent law, so taxes don't go up automatically in 2026. And keep in mind that the middle-class tax cuts enacted in tax reform are not just about lower tax rates for middle-income workers and families. They're also about small business owners and family farmers. For the millions of small family-owned businesses and family farmers, tax reform of 2017 provided a 20% deduction for qualified business income under Section 199A. The whole purpose of that was to be for individual filers to reduce the inequity between a lower corporate tax rate and what individuals would pay if they're in business to compensate for the capital that they have to have invested for their small business. According to the recently released 2018 IRS data, in Iowa alone, my state alone, nearly 215,000 small businesses and farms across our state benefited from this 20% deduction in Section 199A. Now, Republicans are committed to making that provision permanent as a very important tool for those small businesses and farms to grow, invest, and provide critically needed jobs in our communities. However, Mr. Biden's tax plan doesn't include any proposal to make permanent or even extend the middle tax cuts enacted under President Trump. Indeed, every independent third-party review of his tax proposal assumes his intent is to allow the tax increases to come into effect, and with good reason, because on the campaign trail, Mr. Biden has stated, quote, "On day one, I will move to eliminate the Trump tax cuts," end of quote. It can't be both that he will only raise taxes on those with incomes over $400,000 and repeal the Trump tax cuts in their entirety. So, who can blame taxpayers for being skeptical when Mr. Biden says that he won't raise their taxes? Every indication is that he will raise taxes on people below $400,000 a year income. Under a Biden administration, middle-income individuals can expect a Biden plan that rolls back the Trump tax cuts. This means he will increase their tax rates, increase the amount of their income subject to tax, and reduce tax benefits for families. Similarly, small business owners and family farmers can also expect him to tax a larger share of their business income. While Mr. Biden has tried to position himself as a centrist on this tax issue, his tax and economic agendas is not all that different from his far-left opponents in the Democratic primaries. His sale pitch may be different, but his agenda will have the same detrimental effect. As the Wall Street Journal editorial board summed it up, the problem with the Biden policies is, quote, "They will have a long-term corrosive impact by raising the cost of capital, by reducing the incentive to work and invest, and lastly, reducing productivity across the economy. Americans will pay the price in a lower standard of living than they would otherwise have and that they deserve," end of quote. I yield the floor.